So today what we're going to be doing is the test for the original game screen. So test 1 is to check to see that the player can see what they're required to see. So what should be expected is the player that can see their cards, they can see their chip count, and whether they are small blind, big blind, or the dealer, which is indicated by the tokens on the table. So let's start that test now. We'll just do a game with 3 players. So we can see that it's this second player's turn. They are the dealer by the token to the left of their starting chip count, and their chip count is 40, which is what I asked it to be, and that you can see that the player can see their cards, which is an ace and a 10. So that test is successful. Test 2 is to check to see if when looking at other players' cards they can't see their cards, they can only see the back of their cards. So still this player 2's turn. If we look at the other 2 players, we can only see a red design with a white outline, which is the back of the cards. So we know that this test is successful. So that's a pass. Test 3 is to see that to check that when looking at the shared cards that the player can see the correct amounts required throughout the game. This will change, however. So at the start, in the first betting round, you should be able to see 0 shared cards and only the backs of the shared cards. After the flop, 3 cards should be seen. After the turn, 4 cards should be seen. And after the river, 5 cards should be seen. So we'll just run that through now. So we can see that there are 5 cards here that can't be seen. And that's the 5 shared cards because it's the first betting round. So that is successful there. If we just run through and get the flop dealt, we can see that there are 3 shared cards and 2 backs of the shared cards, and this is the correct amount of how many the player should be able to see. And we can see that as we move through the players can all see the same shared cards, and they're not seeing different shared cards. So now the turn's been dealt, they can see 4 shared cards and 1 back of the shared card. So that's correct. And again, as we go through the players, we can see that each player is seeing the same cards in the centre of the game. Now the river's been dealt, we can see 5 shared cards and we can't see any backs of the shared cards. And again, as we move through the players, all players can see the same shared cards. So that test is successful. Test 4 is, have the blinds been assigned to the correct player in correspondence to the dealer? So that means that the player after the dealer clockwise should be the small blind, the player after the small blind clockwise should be the big blind. So as we can see here, the player's turn, who it is dealer, and the next player after them clockwise is the small blind, which is player number 1, and the player next after the small blind is player 2, which is the big blind, all notified by the tokens to the left of their chip count. So that test is successful. Test 5 is, are the blinds making the player pay the correct amount? So the player that is the small blind should pay the amount chosen by the user at the start, which was 2, and the player that is the big blind should pay double the amount, which is 4. So we can see here the player that is small blind, player 1, is paying 2, and this has been subtracted from their chip count, and the player that is big blind is 4. So we can see that that's been subtracted from their chip count. So that is successful. So the 6th test is, has the pot been incremented to the sum of the blinds and is that displayed? So what should be expected is the pot equals the sum of the blinds, or another way to think about it is 3 times the small blind, which in this instance should be 6. So here we can see in the blinds it's 2 plus 4, which is 6, and in the pot in the centre we have 6. So that test is passed. Test 7 is the exit game button functionality. So when the exit game button is pressed, the game should be exited in a safe manner without any errors occurring. So we'll go ahead and do that now. This is bottom top left, which is highlighted. If I click it, it should exit the game, which it does. If we could just check to see that none of the errors have occurred, which they haven't. All this stuff is just stuff I've been printing to test in previous tests, but no errors are being thrown out. So we'll just go ahead and run so we can continue with our next tests. So that test is a pass. Test 8 is the player chip count labels display and whether it can be clicked. So all the chip counts should be correct in correspondence to the amount taken out from the blinds that have been chosen by the user at the start of the game. These are labels, so they shouldn't be clickable by the user as well. So if we go ahead and choose 3 players again, we'll choose a starting count of 50. So all players should be starting count 50, and then the blinds will keep at 2, and the big blind therefore should be 4. Actually, we'll move the small blind to be 4, and the big blind therefore should be 8. So here we can see the starting chip count is 50, and the dealer hasn't decreased in starting chip count because they are not a blind, which is exactly right. And the player that is the small blind is paying 4, which is what I chose, and they've decreased by 4 in their chip counts. And the player that is big blind is 8, and they've decreased by 8, which is all correct. So that is a pass. So test 9 is data chosen on the menu should seem to be correct when playing the game. So what should be expected is that there should be the same number of players as the amount chosen by the user, the starting chip count, and the blind should also be the same as what the user chose. So as you can see, I just started a new game with 3 players, starting chip count of 5, and small blind of 4. So we can see that there are 3 sets of cards on the game, which indicates that there are 3 players playing. We can see by the player whose turn it is and has the dealer token that the starting chip count is 50, which is what I set it to be at the start. And we can see by the player with the small blind token that they have the correct small blind because I asked for them to be 4, and they have a small blind of 4. So that test is successful and we have passed. So test 10 is the betting slider functionality. So when the user clicks on the slider and whilst the user holds down click and the user's mouse is dragged over the slider will move in accordance with the mouse. So as we can see bottom right, when I click I get a grey dot, and this dot follows my mouse and the slider moves up and down as I move my mouse. So that test is successful. Test 11 is the betting slider output/display. So the slider should range from the lower limit, which is the small blind, to the upper limit, which is double the big blind. This will change dependent on the small blind the user chose at the start, but we can demonstrate this quite easily by just doing 2 games. So as we can see, the small blind is 4. If I go right to the bottom, I can choose a 4 on the slider. And then the big blind is 8, so the upper limit should be 16. So if I go all the way to the top, I've got 16 in my betting, which is just left of the bet button. So that one is correct. Test 12 is the bet submission button functionality. If the user was to bet a too small amount for the game, so if they were to bet an amount smaller than the maximum bet by any other player, the game should not accept this. If the user was to bet the same or more than the maximum bet already in play, then the game would accept this if the button is pressed. The bet submitted will equal that set by the slider, and then after the bet is placed, the player's turn will end. There's a lot to test here, but we'll just run through that quickly. So as we can see, if I chose to bet 4, which is less than the big blind, so it shouldn't be accepted. If I bet that, you can see nothing happens to the player's turn, nothing happens to their chip count because the game does not accept this. If I go up to a bet of 8, which is the big blind, we should see that this is accepted and the player's turn is moved on. As we can see, I've clicked the bet button there. 8, they have bet 8 out of their chip counts, and their chip count has been decreased by the correct amount. So if I was now to bet more than the highest amounts, they've already betted 4. So if I was to bet a further 8, then this should be accepted. which it is, and correct amount has been deducted from the chip count, and the bet this round has been increased by the right amount. So if I just go ahead and make everyone on the same and get the flopped out, that will help later on. So that test is successful. So the next test is the check button functionality. So this is when the button is pressed, it should basically play a bet of 0, but the same rules apply. So this bet won't be accepted if this is smaller than the maximum bet in play, which is why I've just moved on to the betting round after the flop, because it'll mean we're able to check. However, if this is equal or more than the highest bet, then this bet should be accepted. So after this bet is placed, bet or check is placed, the player's turn will be ended and it will go on to the next player's turn. So, as we can see here, all players have a bet of 0. They have not bet this round. So if I was to go ahead and press the check button here, it will move on to the next player's turn, because the maximum bet is 0 and a check button is basically the same as betting 0. And it moves on to the next turn and the chip count of that player isn't affected. So that test is successful.